All right, folks, welcome to our last session for day 3 of the Canadian Space Summit. The session titled Space Policy and Law, and I'll introduce our amazing organizer slash moderator, Varsha Shankar, and then Varsha can take the conversation and jump into it. So Varsha Shankar is a computer scientist, a roboticist, and business graduate by training. She lives at the intersection of product and AI with 3 years of product experience and 7+ years of AI and computer science experience. Her vision for the present and the future lie firmly in space, and over the last year, she's been using her skills in the space sector in both volunteer and professional roles. She's a data product advisor at Space2Space Ventures, the world's first public space investment portal. She leads society development at the Canadian Space Society, is passionate about engaging with the space community. And over to you, Varsha. Thank you so much for doing this, and I'll let you jump off for the panelists.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Hussein, for the extremely kind words. Welcome everybody to our final panel and the most exciting panel of the day. We're so happy to have all of you here. We are joined today by 2 Canadian experts in the field to talk about space law and policy governing in situ resource development. I'll begin with short introductions about our panelists. We'll start with Maria Manoli. Hi, Maria. She is a doctoral candidate in...
Hello.
Hi. So Maria is a doctoral candidate in space law at the Institute of Air and Space Law at McGill University. Her research focuses on the legal and theoretical aspects of space natural resource exploration. And our second panelist is Dr. David Kendall. He is the past chair of United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space between 2016 to 17. He has held senior positions with the CSA, including Director General of Space Science and Technology. He is also a faculty member of the ISU in France and a founding member of the Outer Space Institute. He holds an undergraduate degree in physics and doctoral degrees in atmospheric physics. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Thank you so much for being here today. Alrighty, let's kick things off with a topic that's probably something that you've come across in the news lately. So Maria and Dr. Kendall, how do you see international efforts such as the Artemis Accords affecting Canada?
I'll let Maria start, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Hello and good day, everyone. Before I answer this question, I would like to thank the organizers of the Canadian Space Summit for this invitation and to congratulate everyone for so far so successful summit. I would also like to say that I'm especially honored to be speaking today on this panel together with Dr. Kendall, that's an expert in space law and policy. And so, as Varsha mentioned, I'm a doctoral candidate at the Institute of Air and Space Law of the Faculty of Law at McGill University. And I'm currently completing my PhD in space law. So I will answer this question in the context of my doctoral thesis. I am working on legal policy and, more importantly, the theoretical issues regarding the exploration and potential exploitation of space natural resources. So my work originates from a very simple legal question, but it has many more dimensions, most of them non-legal or extra-legal. And as one would imagine, this main question is whether space mining or whether the exploration of space natural resources is legal, or even better, whether commercial space mining is legal. So to explore this question, one needs to explore the context and the system within which we ask this question. Is it a question that can be answered by examining it at international and global levels? Is it a question that extends to the domestic level? Is it a question that concerns only states or private actors and states alike? How important is the related policies, especially national space policies that eventually lead to the formation and change of the law? And to begin with, I would like to mention that international law does not contain so far a specific legal regime relating to space mining. There are, however, relevant provisions in the Outer Space Treaty and in the Moon Agreement that provide useful guidance as to whether space mining should be allowed and under what circumstances. As the scholarship on space law and policy observes, and as the discussions in the UN COPUS, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, within the last 10 more or less years have shown, this international legal regime is not considered sufficient, neither to show what are the limits and limitations of space mining, nor how it should be conducted, should it be considered legal. We also saw recently with the signing of the Artemis Accords that major space-faring nations seem to also identify the need for new laws and regulations addressing the challenges of space mining. And indeed, such laws often appear to be missing from the international law scene. And the main reason is that the initial focus of space law and the rationale within which the Outer Space Treaty was created emerged through the spirit of disarmament, and it focused on the promotion and preservation of outer space for peaceful purposes. It did not emerge through a space law specific approach, but it was a result of the general efforts of the disarmament of the Cold War era. And indeed, the first resolutions that referred to the use of outer space are disarmament resolutions, and the first contractual instruments of space law, with one of the first ones being the Outer Space Treaty, but not the first one, do not take into specific consideration a potential commercial use and exploration of the physical environment of outer space, such as space resources. At the same time, the international space law regime, as most international regimes, is a very much state-centric regime. This is especially obvious, for example, in the responsibility mechanism of the Outer Space Treaty, which renders states responsible for national activities in outer space, including activities of non-governmental actors, which states are under the obligation to continuously supervise. And this is, in fact, one of the only times when the non-governmental entities are mentioned in the entire treaty. So in the traditional or in the international space law regime, we see that private actors are not foreseen as independent players in space activities. Yet we see today that the importance of private actors and the importance of the cooperation between states and private actors is ever growing, especially in the field of space mining, where private actors play a key role in the realization of this activity. Hence, the advent of domestic laws, such as the laws of Luxembourg, for example, about which I hope we will have the time to talk later on, and the advent of unilateral and limited multilateral efforts, such as the Artemis Accords, efforts for the creation of a regime for the exploration and commercial use of space natural resources, a regime inclusive of both public and private actors, such as the Artemis Accords, like I said, which is a set of principles for cooperation in the civil exploration and use of celestial bodies for peaceful purposes, as it's mentioned in the title of the agreement. It was proposed by the US and already signed by 8 spacefaring nations, including Canada, the founding members of the agreement. I will not take position on whether I agree or not with this development, but I will share my view from an academic standpoint during our discussions. So these were the initial remarks, the introductory remarks I wanted to share with you. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you, Varsha, very much.
Okay, there we go. Thank you, Maria. That was, I think, a very thorough introduction to the legal aspects. I'm going to try and put this into a geopolitical context, because clearly the question was, how is it affecting Canada? And Canada, which has a long history in developing and working with other nations and leading some aspects of space law and space policy. Is in an interesting position, as we all know, since we have a neighbor that we rely on very intently, extensively for our economy. And I think that the Artemis Accords need to be put into some sort of context with respect to the US, which of course is leading the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords have come effectively are a progression from the 2015 Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act from the US, which broke really new ground. And that new ground, which was very controversial at the time, I would say less so now, effectively stated that private citizens in the US could extract and own space material from asteroids, from the moon, from other bodies. And as Maria quite rightly pointed out, this has been the legality of this is still under significant discussion amongst the space legal community. Nevertheless, my experience with UN COPIUS would suggest that while in 2015, as I said, this was extremely controversial, and with a lot of many states coming out and saying that this is simply not the way to move forward. Nevertheless, that law, that act in the United States, which also noted that it would be subject to international law, has remained. It has not been modified, and is in fact, I would say, being built upon by the recent administration in the United States in two ways. The first of all is through an executive order that was issued in April of 2020, April of this year, by the US president with the title "Encouraging International Support for the Recovery and Use of Space Resources." This went even further than the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in that it effectively did, I would say, had two major elements. One, that it rejected the idea that space is a global commons, although global commons, you do not find the word global commons in any of the space, the 5 space treaties that Maria mentioned. Nevertheless, it has a general meaning, and Maria might want to comment on this from a legal point of view, has a general understanding, customary law, that these are areas that are under no specific jurisdictions, no national jurisdiction, and need to be considered in a special case. And there are several of these areas which are generally described in this way, including the high seas, Antarctica, and the space arena. And this has been traditionally a description that has been described for these areas for many years. And specifically with the Antarctic and the and the high seas, specific agreements have been signed, multilateral agreements have been signed as to how one conducts one's business and in these areas, how nations conduct business in these areas, and rules on how you can extract or explore those areas, specifically with minerals and etc. So this was an interesting new twist, I would say, on the issue. And the other part of the executive order of April 2020 was that the United States rejected completely any new discussion of the so-called Moon Agreement that Maria has mentioned. Now, the Moon Agreement is the last of the 5 major treaties that were signed in the 60s and 70s and 80s. In fact, the Moon Agreement was signed in 1984. and is by far the weakest of those treaties, only having 18 adherents and 4 signatories. Nevertheless, that was, I would say, a very specific stick in the sand. And then, of course, this was followed by the Artemis Accords, which is the point of this question, which are principles, as Maria quite rightly pointed out, a number of principles that the US have put forward as to how to conduct activities in exploration of space, and specifically with respect to human exploration of space. This is now we're moving into an area of significant interest in moving humanity out from beyond low Earth orbit on a more permanent basis. And so how should states conduct their business there? Normally, these types of discussions would happen under a multilateral framework in a body such as UN COPIUS, which has been specifically set up to develop these. The US decided that they wanted to, I would not say subvert, I would say maybe push this agenda forward a little bit more rapidly than normally would happen under the rather slow and deliberate discussions that happen in UN COPIUS. Remember, UN COPIUS has currently 95 member states. It's one of the larger of the UN committees, and it works under consensus rules. In other words, all 95 states have to agree on any particular recommendation before it gets approved and moves forward to the General Assembly. And within the current geopolitical context, of course, that is extremely tricky and extremely difficult. And so although this is the US, I don't think have ever come out and said this publicly, I believe that one of the reasons that they put the Artemis Accords forward rather than moving through UN COPIUS was that they wanted to, let's say, speed up that process and work with like-minded countries to start developing some best practices. Because, as Maria quite rightly pointed out, best practices and guidelines are desperately needed because of the gaps within the treaties right now as to how one should conduct oneself in areas which were not considered at the time of the signing of those treaties. So we have these accords. When they first came out, there was a lot of discussion on the US sort of basically pushing its weight around, one might say, saying that this is the way things should be, and if you don't want to join us, then if you don't want to sign up to these ideas and principles, then we don't really want you to be partners with us. And that has a certain, I would say, brought a certain amount of certainly discussion and difficulty. So in the end, the document that has been now signed, and I was just looking at the document to see the date. I think it's in October that it was signed. I think it was October the 13th, the signing ceremony took place on the margins of a virtual IAC meeting. And as Maria quite rightly points out, 8 states are the initial signatories. Now, one of the interesting aspects is that the section 10 of this document, which is publicly available, you can get it from the web, on space resources, is, in my opinion and opinion of others, very much watered down from what the United States, I believe, really wanted it to be. If you understand the Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act and the executive order from the president, one would have imagined that the US were going to push very hard to have their ideas with respect to the ownership of private ownership of space resources to be somehow incorporated into that document. It hasn't been. And I believe, although I have no direct proof of this, I have indirect sort of indication that the other signatories, and Australia, Canada, Italy, Japan, Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, and the United Kingdom push back fairly strongly on the United States and saying, look, there is still too much open debate here on these topics, as Maria has quite rightly pointed out. There are too many legal issues that need to be dealt with. And the section in this, I think, is fairly reasonable. First of all, that the signatories note that the utilization of space resources can benefit humankind by providing critical support and for safe and sustainable operations. And I think this is a very interesting statement. If we are, as humanity, going to explore beyond low Earth orbit on any sort of permanent or semi-permanent way, we are going to have to use space resources. There is no ifs or buts there. The question then becomes, and so I think that debate has been effectively put to bed. The debate, of course, is how this exploration and exploitation will happen. They also, the second part of this of the Artemis Accords section on space resources sort of basically says that the signatories emphasize that this work, this space mining, one might say, should be executed in a manner that complies with the Outer Space Treaty and in support of safe and sustainable space activities. And so they are quite rightly and now saying that the Outer Space Treaty cannot be compromised here. They also commit to informing the Secretary General of the United Nations, as well as the public and the international scientific community, of their space resource extraction activities in accordance with the Outer Space Treaty. And lastly, they intend to use their experience under the Accords to contribute to multilateral efforts to further develop international practices and rules applicable to the extraction and utilization of space resources, including through ongoing efforts at the COPUOS. And to me, that is the best news that I see from this. And I think that the other states have done an excellent job at persuading the US to develop these activities through UN COPUOS. And so what does it mean? How does it affect Canada? I think right now, as Canada starts to think about its own activities through its commercial entities in space mining, and we can get onto that a little bit later in the discussion. There's a very interesting part of the new Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan, which Natural Resources Canada have put together that support the idea that Canada should start to think very seriously about this. But on the policy side, I think now the 8 signatories saying that this should now be discussed at multilateral level at COPUOS is very good news, and we hope, and I hope that, and I believe that there will be, starting next April, when the legal subcommittee meets in Vienna, either in person or virtual. We'll see how the pandemic develops by that time, that we will have a very lively and debate about how to move forward with the possibility and potential of developing a working group and a new working group on this subject. And this is one of the areas through the Outer Space Institute that I am particularly interested in. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Maria and Dr. Kendall. That was extremely
Hey, Varsha, can I just add a comment that
Absolutely.
I forgot to mention earlier? Yeah, so although Section 10 does put important weight on international cooperation, on the contribution to multilateral efforts and the transparency required in resource extraction operations, I think it has to be mentioned that the same section fails to explain in what way the extraction and recovery of resources would be compatible with the international regime, the Outer Space Treaty, and specifically its Article 2. It is, of course, too early to tell whether this development will be successful and whether it would potentially lead to international cooperation and to a wider multilateralism. But so far, we have seen that the reaction by other states has been both positive and negative We saw that the number of spacefaring nations, including Canada, agreed with this development, but we also noticed the negative views by other states and quite a lot of controversy within the academic milieu. And a lot of questions arise together with these Artemis Accords, and these are questions for further discussion. But for example, one of these questions would be whether the Accords could be considered as a tool to interpret the Outer Space Treaty according to the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, given that the states that have signed the Artemis Accords have also signed the Outer Space Treaty, and whether we talk about subsequent agreements that aim to change the initial purpose and understanding of the treaty, a question that could only be answered if, of course, the number of signatory states increases. One more impact at the international level is also whether the participation of states in the Accords demonstrates the beginning of the creation of Gaston, perhaps, that could eventually change the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty. And to answer your question, the second part of your question, which I forgot earlier, I'm sorry about that, the impact on Canada. Canada, by signing the Artemis Accords, showed once more that it continues to be a leader in space exploration and that it is willing to participate in any means that become available towards the advancement of space exploration. So the positive impact on Canada is that the signing of the Accords will enable Canada to engage in more collaborations with other countries and with the industry and perhaps become a leader in space resources exploration. But on the other hand, this initiative is an initiative of quite limited multilateralism. It started as unilateral and it enjoyed very limited multilateralism. So it was discussed by it was not discussed by a wide range of states, and it set aside the developing countries too. So I think that it is a good sign of cooperation, but similar efforts should perhaps, as Dr. Kental pointed out, take place in a broader context, such as perhaps in the context of the Moon Agreement, which for me is the most appropriate existing international legal instrument that could legally enable the rational commercial exploitation of space resources. So overall, the involvement of Canada in the Accords shows that Canada remains one of the leading nations in space exploration, but at the same time, it shows the involvement of Canada in an effort of limited reach. That was my comment.
That was super on point. And actually that discussion led to a number of threads that I really want to pull on. I really wish we had more than just 1 hour. But maybe if I could latch on to the last statement you made there, Maria, which is it was extremely positive in that a number of states signed on to the agreement. But there remained an open question as to countries that chose not to do that. What impact do you really see going forward to perhaps India and China, who did not sign on to the Artemis Accords and could possibly also venture into space resource utilization themselves?
Yes, thank you for that question. I will insist and I will say that we need a much more multilateral effort, perhaps under the auspices of the UN. This was a good initiative. It was a wake-up call, but I think now the topic should move forward and be discussed more thoroughly, more systematically within the UN, and either a new comprehensive convention should be agreed, or perhaps the Moon Agreement could be reviewed or revisited, or just a wider multilateral. That's what I see. That's the only way I see more and more countries being involved.
And let me say that I totally agree with what Maria has said. There's no question that this now has to move forward into a multilateral regime. And remember that the words of the what has been stated and put down in the Artemis Accords will be changed dramatically, in my opinion, as we get into multilateral discussions. You mentioned India, you mentioned China, of course, Russia will be very engaged, has to be very engaged in moving forward. And we will see significant subtleties and even major changes to the way that space exploration agreements will be developed in the future and through UN COPIUS. This is the way that COPIUS works. And so agreeing with Maria that this is an interesting and I would say positive first step. It has pushed states now into saying, okay, the wake-up call, as Maria said. We need now to, the US are going to the moon. They're going to the moon with humans and a lot of hardware. China is already there. India is already there. The Europeans are already there, etc. And we will see now how this all develops in the future. But there's absolutely no question that in order to have a successful process, we need now, we being the states, need to engage the major players. And you mentioned China, you mentioned India, and of course one has to add Russia, the Russian Federation. And although Europe is there already to some extent, I think that with respect to the Accords, they need to, and there is, as one knows, great debate within the European Union, within ESA right now, as to how they're going to develop their own agreements, let's say, and their own accords, their own ideas, best practices with respect to space exploration. And let me pick up one more point that Maria said, which I absolutely and totally agree with. There is an opportunity here for Canada to play, I think, as Maria points out, a significant leadership role as we move forward, because of Canada's history as a reasonable second-tier nation, one might say, with lots of contacts and with multilateralism as part of its makeup. I think that Canada has a very strong opportunity here to play a major role in developing through these forums and specifically through COPIUS as a champion to bring these states together, which will take some time and will take a lot of effort. And if Canada is willing to expend that effort, I think we have a great opportunity. So I look forward to working with the government of Canada through Global Affairs, etc., to see if they see this as a potential new area that they could influence and play a major role. Thank you.
Absolutely. To pull on one of the other threads that we had going on before around Luxembourg and their championing of in situ space, in situ resource utilization, what are some of your thoughts on their approach? And again, bringing that back to a Canadian context, what does it mean for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Varsha. Indeed, Luxembourg, some 4 years ago now, in 2016, adopted a new law relating to the use and exploration of space natural resources. The law clearly provided that space natural resources are capable of being appropriated, and that's the exact wording that was used in the first article of this law. With this law, Luxembourg managed to attract a respectable number of space companies and private space investment. And as we read in many of the relevant press releases by the government of Luxembourg, the purpose of this law was to provide legal clarity and certainty, a legal environment friendly to private space actors, and to become the hub, Luxembourg to become the hub of space mining in Europe. And in part, it has been successful in achieving these objectives. Following this law, we saw other nations adopted similar approaches, and Luxembourg managed to enter into agreements and memoranda of understanding with other states, as well as it achieved partnerships with the private space industry. This development, however, did receive also criticism, mainly for the wording used in the space, that the space resources are capable of being appropriated, which is in contrast with Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty. The impact of this law, I would say, was more noticeable at the national level due to its success in attracting private space actors. At the international level, as I mentioned earlier, one could say that again, it led to a more and more similar domestic laws. And here the question of the eventual creation of GASTOM is raised, and whether the ensemble of similar domestic initiatives could reverse eventually the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty. But we should not forget that the Outer Space Treaty is a treaty that reflects a strong anti-colonial rationale. And to build on that, it means to promote inclusivity and decision-making at the international and global levels, not at the domestic level, which was the case with the Law of Luxembourg. I do not believe that the Law of Luxembourg has any particular impact on Canada, other than the general impact that it has internationally. We have to mention here, though, that regardless of the provisions of its domestic space law, Luxembourg still remains bound by the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, and thus the provisions of Article 2 of the treaty, which prohibits appropriation, are still valid for Luxembourg. So Luxembourg is still responsible for ensuring that its space activities respect the provisions of the Outer Space Treaty, regardless of the provisions of its domestic laws. So while I cannot see a major impact on Canada, I can see an opportunity. The legislation of Luxembourg and all other similar laws and the Artemis Accords show that states are getting ready to take the next step in the regulation of space mining. In my opinion, adopting a domestic law is one option, but I would more importantly suggest that Canada show its leadership by engaging in multilateral approaches and by signing the Moon Agreement, perhaps, and in essence, by being one of the first spacefaring nations to lead truly multilateral efforts in the use and exploration of space natural resources. Thank you very much.
I can only applaud Maria for her very complete answer to that, and I have no further comments, so thank you.
The thing that you mentioned right at the end there, Maria, it kind of dovetails into what I was going to say was my next question. We've talked about the United States taking on a leadership role in this area. We also briefly touched on Luxembourg. You talked about Canada taking on a leadership role in a similar way. And that extended to spearheading more multilateral agreements with the rest of the world. What other areas do you think Canada can really stand out and bring to the table and be a leader in making space resource utilization fair and free for all?
Maybe I can. I'll jump in on this one, and then Maria can follow. The issue for Canada, I believe, is currently how to get a whole of government approach into what we think about space resources. Space is very diverse. Let's say governance process here in Canada. We know that, of course, the Canadian Space Agency. We know that with respect to UN COPIUS, Global Affairs Canada. Environment Canada has a role, Department of National Defense has a role, etc. And one of the interesting questions about space resources is that now we have, I would say, a new player with respect to Natural Resources Canada, that last year in March of 2019 came out with a Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan. And in that plan, it mentions that the Natural Resources Canada and the government should start to think seriously about how to move into space mining. As we all know, Canada, along with Australia, are the two leading nations with by far the most multilateral big mining companies. And there has been some push from some of those mining companies who have a lot of experience in working in very remote and unforgiving environments, how to mine in those areas. And it would seem natural that Canada should be thinking very seriously about this. And I was very pleased to see this Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan that promoted the idea that Canada should start to develop some ideas, and this has to be led by government. Canadian companies will not, mining companies will not start moving forward until the Canadian government has a policy and some and has formulated its plans and ideas with respect to this sector. So in speaking with people from NRCan and others, I know that that there is a informal sort of group now of government departments that are speaking together about this and on a regular basis. But now it needs some action. It really needs for the Government of Canada working together through the government departments to come up with a specific plan as to how they are going to support such activities. Excuse me. One of the parts of the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan is that the Natural Resources Canada are planning to develop a series of action plans. And the first of which it says will be released in 2020. Well, I haven't quite seen it yet, but we know that there's been lots of delays due to various issues. But I would urge, my advice to the Canadian government on space resources is first of all, get your act together. Make sure that the Canadian Space Agency, that Global Affairs Canada, that Natural Resources Canada, Department of National Defense, that Industry Canada, et cetera, right the way up to, I'd say, the Prime Minister's office, understand what they want, where they want Canada to be in this area. This is important. This is, if Canada's going to get serious about any leadership here, we need the government to come together. And as far as I can gather, I wouldn't say it hasn't come together. What I'm saying is that the discussions are ongoing, and there has been no specific indication of a plan or a timetable to have this developed. And so I would love to see this happen. Now, there has been a call from the Canadian Space Agency for stakeholders and interested individuals to provide them by the end of next January ideas with respect to how Canada should move forward in exploration in general. This is very welcome. Hopefully a lot of people who are listening in and members of the Canadian Space Society and the Society itself will put in a brief into the government indicating how they would like Canada to develop its exploration program across the various departments. Some of it led by the Canadian Space Agency and some of it led by other government departments. And I think here's an opportunity with respect to this particular topic, space mining, for companies, for organizations such as the Canadian Space Society and others to put in some strong words as to how they see Canada moving forward with this. I think that both Maria and I agree with hopefully a leadership position as we move forward. One extra topic I will talk about here is how we might be able to work with some of the signatories of the Moon Agreement, of the Artemis Accords right now. And I specifically want to point out Australia. Australia is an interesting state in that it is the other large mining country in the world, along with Canada. It has signed, of course, the Outer Space Treaty. It has signed the Artemis Accords. And uniquely amongst those 8 signatories, it has signed the Moon Agreement. So we have a country here that, and is part of Canada's, part of the so-called Five Eyes. We have close relationships in defense and other areas with Australia. A partnership with Australia, to me, would be extremely interesting, and I would urge the government of Canada to start looking at hopefully maybe developing some suggestions and some ideas along with Australia on how to move forward. That's just another thing that I would like to throw out. So I will pass it on to Maria.
Thank you. And I will pick up on your last comment about Australia. And I would say that my advice would be to start by signing the Moon Agreement, and in that way showing leadership in international space cooperation. The Moon Agreement is an often overlooked agreement, and it is true that no spacefaring nations except Australia have signed it. But at the same time, it is the only existing international legal instrument that specifically addresses the possibility of commercial exploitation of space natural resources. So why not sign it if it is what we are looking for? Of course, the agreement has created a lot of controversy, which has also led to its limited acceptance by states, but it is a comprehensive and inclusive agreement. The main wording that has caused controversy is the characterization of the resources as the common heritage of mankind, of humankind. But I would suggest that we look into the substance of the agreement and the mechanism that it suggests, not that the wordings that it uses. This is an old wording, a wording that was created in an era perhaps not applicable right now. For example, the agreement takes into account the environmental impact of space activities that can have, in a way, more substantial than the Outer Space Treaty. It also takes into account the right of future generations to the access to and the use of outer space. With regards to its specific provisions on space mining, the agreement would enable Canada to be a leader in suggesting the creation of an international rules-based regime for space utilization by activating paragraph 5 of Article 11 of the agreement, and to the subsequent creation of relevant procedural mechanisms. So the Moon Agreement is not something that states should be afraid of, in my opinion. On the contrary, it is the only way to regulate space mining at a truly international and global level, to avoid conflicts and to avoid the entire discussion about whether space resources can be appropriated or not, because this is what is causing the biggest obstacle. The agreement clearly states that appropriation is prohibited, as the Outer Space Treaty does, but it also clearly provides that the resources can be used and exploited in Article 11, paragraph 5. At the same time, it takes into consideration the interests of all stakeholders, and it allows the directly and indirectly involved countries to receive privileged compensation, privileged benefits that result from space mining activities. So this is my personal opinion that the Moon Agreement will be signed eventually by all spacefaring nations, sooner or later, because it is what we have been looking for all these years. The agreement is there and it's ready. And it provides the rationale, it provides the structure, and it leaves it up to the states to negotiate further and to build new mechanisms. So my advice would be to go for it, set the example for other states to follow, and in that way remain a leader in enabling international space cooperation.
This is wonderful. My key takeaway as a layperson would be that the situation is rapidly evolving. It's a very exciting time to be alive, practically pivotal, and that we as a nation, we as a civilization need to be leaders and think about humanity as a whole when we make these decisive actions. I am going to stop my questions over here because I see a number of our attendees have many, many questions for you, as I completely expected. So I'm going to jump right into that. The first question we have is, if space mining is extremely profitable, will current legal restrictions matter, or will treaties be ignored in favor of economic and geopolitical gain? That's such a hard one.
Okay, let me jump in, and then Maria can. It's an excellent question, because effectively, in my opinion, that's the threat. The threat that is behind this all is that all the treaties, of course, are bind states to develop their programs through the treaty agreements. There's also articles in the Outer Space Treaty which says that states are in the end liable for the activities of their commercial and private actors. So there is states need to get very serious about regulating their own activities from the private sector. Otherwise, if something happens out there and if there's a liability issue and a claim, then it's not the private sector, as we know. It's the entity that will be on the hook. It will be the state on the hook. So so there is but on the other hand, we have already witnessed and experienced private entities that have, let's say, been less than fully transparent in developing some activities in outer space, and there are the issue of India launching a number of very small satellites, CubeSats, that the US government effectively said, we won't give you a license, but they went ahead and launched them anyway. And then, of course, the tardigrades on the moon, which we don't need to get into. But there are a number of issues here that are starting to appear. And can states rein in their private actors, because there's some very innovative ideas out there, and which is great. Don't get me wrong here. And the private sector is moving at a speed that is unusually fast, even in high-tech technology these days, with respect to what they're doing in space. And so if it gets out of hand, one might say, then we are in trouble. So we do need to move quickly, and I would say seriously, about getting these guidelines and these best practices somehow agreed upon by everybody, including the commercial sector. And let's say the commercial sector is clearly open to having such agreements. Because it helps them in their business case. They have to raise money, and investors don't like to have uncertainty. Therefore, it is absolutely, everybody wants these to happen, but they have to start getting serious, and it has to happen a little bit more quickly than we have seen these agreements to develop in the past. So over to you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make an observation and see how interesting it is to note how the power of the private space industry is being institutionalized into law through domestic laws, and how it is influencing law, and how it is eventually leading to the change and the formation of new laws. And that's the risk, how the economy will have a direct effect on law. And international law is there, it doesn't change unless it eventually changes through the formation of custom. But right now it is there. We do have these conventions in place. So I think that the next step that should be taken, and I will absolutely agree with you, is to work together, to work at the international level, and to move forward with the development of new laws, revisit and renew the old laws, and form laws that correspond to the demands of our times. And Canada should and could have a key role in this activity. As we have seen, as any mining activity and any activity of land exploration has historically been linked with colonialism and with the negative connotations of exploitation. And as Canada has a lot of experience in this regard, I believe that Canada is in an ideal position to promote cooperation in space mining and to suggest ways of how to learn from our mistakes in this industry, which are part of the risk we are taking. Thank you.
I was muted over there. Thank you so much for both of your answers. I'm going to move on to the next question. This one says, what are your thoughts on the impact of the precedent set by NASA to purchase extracted lunar regolith by private entities? And will other countries soon follow suit?
Okay, let me just, I think that this is the latest, I think this is referring to the request for states, for a private state to bring back, I think it's 2 kilograms, 4.5 pounds of, of lunar material as a demonstration. And they have put that out to states recently. Well, you know, it is an interesting question. China is now on its way to the moon to bring back some materials. There are 840 pounds of material roughly sitting in a depository of lunar material in depository in Houston. It's not that, is this breaking new ground? The fact that we are bringing back lunar materials from materials from the moon. The difference, of course, is that now we're asking a private entity to do it rather than a state to do it. If the state went out there and US went out there, or China went out there, India went out, and some of them are going out and brought back some rocks, new rocks from the moon, would anybody be upset? I don't see what the issue is, frankly. Maybe I'm being naive here as to saying, okay, well, it's just like SpaceX are now providing a service to supply the International Space Station with humans. A decade ago, that would have been outrageous. It's not anymore. Is it any different that a private entity is now being contracted to bring back some lunar material? I don't see personally. It's just an evolution, and I don't see an issue here. Maria?
I think you have covered everything. Nothing to add.
Yeah, that was a really interesting piece of news that came out for sure. They didn't even require the private companies to bring the material back to Earth. They were just like, extract it and we'll still pay you for it. So it was definitely a very interesting precedent. Just going down the list here. The other one we have is, how do we avoid carving up the moon into a patchwork of national or private pieces? Is there a more collective way of pursuing in situ research development?
Okay, I know we're running out of time, so I'll be quick here. This is, I think, the biggest issue that we need to get serious about. Since the Outer Space Treaty says that a body such as the moon is available to all, how does, once one puts its cement plant on the South Pole, how does one say, okay, we're not appropriating it? What rules? And there are ways that we can work this through, but it has to be very carefully done. The moon, as we know, has a lot of very interesting places to go, and the possibility to extract water and other minerals. The issue is that these are, although the South Pole and North Pole of the moon is, it's fairly big. Still, there will be places, just like there are on the Earth, where there are specifically very, very interesting material that is useful and valuable. And once one state gets there, is that now saying, okay, we are appropriating it, and how do we share those particular areas? This is the I would say the gorilla in the corner of where we need to discuss, and it's going to take a lot of very intense discussions to work that issue out.
Just to add quickly that the Outer Space Treaty builds on an ideal that's completely different from how we have colonized the Earth. Like it's an ideal completely different from bordered pieces of land where sovereignty is established and where national jurisdiction is established. So I think we should also deviate from this rationale when we talk about space exploration, and we could find a way to do it. I don't know what is the way. For me, the Moon Agreement could be a start, but we should definitely keep in mind that the bordered pieces of land is something that is different from the rationale of the Outer Space Treaty and different from the ideology of space law.
That's a super interesting concept. Yeah, I guess this is like the definition of thinking out of the box. We don't have to have secluded little pieces of land attached to each sovereign nation. I really wish I could go through all of these questions here. They're excellent. Unfortunately, we are past our set time. So I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time, their insights. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Varsha. Thank you, the Canadian Space Society, for allowing me to be part of this. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you, Maria, for your fabulous panel discussion. So thank you.
I would also like to thank you all for this amazing panel discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you, Varsha. Thank you to all the organizers, to the attendees, and thank you very much, Dr. Kendall.
Wonderful. Over to you now, Hussein.